think would be, I think it's not something we want to see happen. But we're not risk fueling extra demand for these people, and the targeting we're doing. These are necessity expenditures as opposed to discretionary ones, and I think that's the distinction. What we don't want to be doing is fueling further excess discretionary spending, which would make the situation potentially worse.
But if you're sending money transferring money to two individuals, they're spending it in one form or another. They're able to conduct expenditure that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to conduct. And surely that's an instant stimulus to the economy.
Well, I mean, look, this is a package which, as I said, I think it will have, we believe, a minimal impact on inflation, but inflation nonetheless. But it will be done in a way that I said what we're doing is doing it in a responsible way. So it's going to those people who are going to spend it on things that are absolutely necessary for them to have a standard of living that we think would be appropriate.
An impact on inflation. What is your assessment?
I think it would be appropriate that the OBR provide a formal independent assessment of that at the time that they do their next official forecasts. I said we believe it will have a minimal impact, is what I've said.
Now, how would you define minimal?
I mean, I think, as I said, I think it's not good for us to get into the sense of having multiple sets of forecasts, which I'm sure you will understand. But I think most people will understand minimal to mean minimal, and know what they take away from that.
Like Brexit means Brexit, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay. And I think that could you just address this third leg, as it were, of the funding, how this has been funded through the tax increase, etc., in the context of inflation for us?
Yes, I mean, there's one revenue-raising measure that was announced at the same time, which is a new energy profits levy, which will raise, we estimate, around £5 billion over the next 12 months, and alongside that, we've said we are urgently considering the case to extend that levy to the electricity generation sector, where we do believe there are extraordinary profits also being made. Many other countries in Europe have taken steps to address that. We have a longer-term plan to reform the market, but we need to make sure that actually in the shorter term have we got the right policy in place. But we are urgently undertaking that work as well.
So the total price tag of the intervention, I think, is 15 billion. There's also the fact that you're converting what was going to be a loan arrangement on energy bills into a grant, which I think adds another 5. You may be able to correct me.
That money was already in all the numbers that
it was
were
there
published
as a
at the
loan
spring
rather
statement.
than a
No, but in
grant.
terms of the fiscal impact of it, it's fully accounted for already in the spring statement forecast. What will change is the payments down the line of about £1 billion a year, but that's £1 billion a year which will impact the future years, and that's in the context of an overall fiscal framework which has debt and borrowing both falling.
If we just therefore start, say, with the 15, and you're raising 5, as you say, in the 12-month period for the windfall tax, where does the other 10 come from? Is that assuming that windfall tax carries on, assuming that the oil price is elevated through time? Or
well, this is a temporary intervention, and we expect the windfall tax to raise around £5 billion over the next 12 months. These aren't one-off payments that will happen over the course of this financial year. And then, as I said, there's a consideration of extending the energy profits levy to the electricity generation sector, so that's an incremental source of revenue, and then the rest, what will be remaining, will be extra borrowing. And
do you have an assessment at this stage how much extra borrowing will be involved?
It's a function of where we end up on the electricity generation.
Do you have a figure in mind which you're hoping to?
No, I mean, so because it's a live situation where we're engaging with the industry, I hopefully understand it's difficult for me to comment too much further on that.
Fair enough. Can I just switch to comments made by the Bank of America about the currency? Now, I'm not expecting you to say anything about where you think the currency is going, etc., and I do understand the sensitivities there, but they've described the currency now as looking a bit like an emerging market currency. We're looking forward to very anemic growth levels, possibly recession. The Bank of America has suggested that the vibe out there, if you like, is that maybe the Bank of England has been not entirely independent in the way that it's interacted with government around quantitative easing and the Treasury seeking to raise large amounts of debt at the same time. Do you have any general comments on that? Is sterling something that's a concern to you at the moment?
No, I mean, I do have confidence in the medium-term outlook for the economy. In the short term, obviously we are experiencing high inflation. Now, we are not alone in that, and you saw very recent figures actually after the statement that came out from the Eurozone, which showed continued high inflation there. But I think we should be clear that what's happening here is, although predominantly driven by global shocks, not exclusively. And there were three particular areas of concern that I flagged in the statement. One was the fact that we are experiencing not just the energy shock that Europe is, but also the very tight labour market that the United States is. So that's something that, although it caused to be celebrated that so many people are in work, that obviously has an inflationary impact. The second thing that I flagged was inflation expectations, which I watch carefully and want to make sure that they are not increasing over the medium term, and they have ticked up slightly more than they have in other places. So we need to be careful about that. And the third thing that is, if you look at our inflation, even outside food and energy, which are the most volatile bits of it and there are external shocks, core inflation is still elevated and is very broad-based. So it's across, I think we said almost 90% or almost all goods and services in the basket are experiencing above target inflation. So those are the three particular things that I flagged as an area of concern. That said, I'm confident that we have the tools and the determination to get inflation down over time. And I'd say whether that's fiscal policy, a strong independent monetary policy, or supply side reform. Those are the three tools we have. We are using all three of them, and that will get inflation down over time. I'm confident of that, and I want people to be reassured that that is the case. And in the short term, the support that we've provided, I think, will make a meaningful difference to people.
Thank you. I wish we could continue this discussion, but time is against us. Anthony.
Thank you, Chair. As the Chair alluded to, and as many your own figures point out and various campaign groups said, the support you gave was very targeted, that those who need the help most get the most help. My question, though, is whether they're still sufficient. There are still potentially some gaps, as the Resolution Foundation pointed out, that multiple children households have bigger costs but don't get more help. I just wonder, do you think that the support you provided, is it sufficient to prevent an increase in child and pensioner poverty?
I think it will make a very significant difference, and I think it has been widely acknowledged as making the biggest difference to those who are most vulnerable. 3/4 of the money we announce goes to those vulnerable households and pensioners, where the most vulnerable third of households, those on means-tested benefits, will receive around £1,200, which is, for a sense of scale, is roughly approximate to the expected increase in energy bills on average year over year. I think comments from both the IFS and the Resolution Foundation, their own analysis, suggests that the vast majority, if not entirety, of certainly the energy bills increase or cost of living increase has been met now by the various interventions that we've put in place. So I think it will make a very significant difference. It was rightly targeted at those who most need help, and I think the distribution analysis that we published at the event also demonstrates that, and Dan probably can add a
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add is that for that the bottom decile, the total value of the support is something like 7% of their household income. So it's a very substantial amount of support for those on the bottom end of the income distribution.
Have you done analysis on the impact on child poverty?
I think not expressly, but as I said, actually we know the single biggest driver of children being in poverty is children growing up in a workless household. And the record over the last few years has been very positive to reducing the number of children that are in workless households. Over 500,000 fewer children today in workless households than there were 10 years ago. So that's good progress. And the policies that we put in place even week before last announcement, for example, raising the national living wage, cutting the UC taper rate, actually really support that incentive for people to work and help make sure they move off welfare into work as well.
Some of the support you have, there are cliff edges. I mean, if you, for example, you could earn £1 more, which takes you off universal credit, but you then lose all the support. Did you look at all the support that's for universal credit recipients? Did you explore options from removing the cliff edge, or was that just too complicated?
I mean, wherever you draw a line, there'll be some people the other side of the line. I mean, that's kind of the inevitable consequence of any policy that is trying to target things. So, what I'd say is we've taken what is the state's existing definition of the most vulnerable people in our society who are deserving of state support, that is all those people on means-tested benefits, right? So regardless of the cost of living situation, we already have a definition of people who need state support to help with their income. That's the definition that we've taken, and we've been generous in our treatment of them. But we also have a universal piece of the support. So even if you are not on benefits, my view is it's still right that the government is trying to do something to ease some of the burden of the increases that we're seeing, given the scale of them. Now, we've done that both with a council tax rebate already, and then with a further £400 through the energy bills system over the autumn. So that's £550 of support on a universal basis, which is obviously significant. Now, the other thing to say is those people, more likely than not, are going to be in work, and they will benefit then disproportionately from things like the national living wage increase or the raise to the national insurance primary threshold coming in July, which is worth £330. So there's other things that we've done that will benefit that group of people.
And just to add, that recognising that there are some of these sort of difficult cases where people are just outside the targeting, that's why the household support fund was increased by a further 500 million, so it runs until the end of March next year. So where people, for one reason or another, are unable to access the targeted support, there's an opportunity to get the targeted support via their local authority.
You said, Chancellor, you said there that's right, the government provides the support, and I think we'd probably all agree with that. But in 1990, inflation was actually at a similar level to what it is now. There's no expectation at that time that the government would step in and help people with their household bills, and they didn't. I'm just wondering whether you think the expectations of the public or of what the government should do in terms of inflation have changed, and what the implications of that are.
Yes, I think the difference, I don't have it to hand, but I would imagine the impact on real incomes would have been smaller then than it is expected to be now. That would be the difference. I think the impact on real incomes as a result of inflation at these levels is more significant now than it was then. So that's why I think there was a case for us.
Upping living standards is far greater even than inflation.
Exactly, to provide some support to help with that bridge.
Yeah. Do you think there were some comments at the time of your announcement that you'll need to do more in future, and presumably you'll say you'll keep it all under a review, but are you braced for having to provide more support in the autumn?
As I said, what we've put in place is significant and extends all the way through to the end of the financial year. We waited until we had a clearer sense of what would happen to energy bills in the autumn, which now that we're about 2/3 of the way through the price cap observation window we have, and you heard from Ofgem just recently on that. So I think actually we've put in place something now that will provide the support that people need. But kind of linking to your previous question, it's not possible for any chancellor to try and make whole all the increases in people's cost of living. That's simply not possible and probably not advisable either, for the reasons that we talked about previously with the risks on inflation. But where we can make a difference that is meaningful to ease some of the burden, we can and we should, and that's what we've done. The best way over time to help people is to make sure we have a growing economy with people in work, with their wages going up, and all the plans that we've got in place will make progress on that goal.
I'd love to ask more questions, but I've run out of time.
I'm going to keep us to time. Everybody must have their time. So, Kevin, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, you got broad support for what you did for households, including from me, but you chose not to provide any support whatsoever for businesses. Why was that?
Thank you, Kevin. For a couple of reasons. I mean, one is the inflation that we're seeing is actually the result of prices being passed through the chain to consumers, in a sense, right? So that's why you're seeing inflation measured for consumers at the levels that we are. They are seeing it being passed on by businesses. So that's happening in that sense. I think the second thing is we've all read, and that is the right way to get at it. I think the second thing is we already have provided different types of support for business, notably business rates holidays coming into this year, 50% discount, which is worth £1.7 billion. Many businesses will benefit from that. It's worth, say, £5,000 for a typical pub, for example. And secondly, the employment allowance tax cut that came into force in the spring, which will mean that about 500,000, give or take, small businesses are going to see £1,000 tax cut on their employment national insurance bill. So that's quite significant support, broad-based, particularly targeted at small businesses and medium-sized businesses. And then slightly more proactively, we're supporting businesses to grow, and whether that's through Help to Grow management, Help to Grow digital, or the annual investment allowance, which is a very generous tax relief on investment. Both the Help to Growth schemes are worth thousands of pounds to just support businesses' further growth and productivity. So there's a lot in place already. And then the last thing I'd say is just for the energy intensive industries, there is an existing scheme that is in place, and in the energy security strategy, the Prime Minister and Energy Secretary made some comments about the future direction of travel for those schemes, which I know they're engaging with those companies on as we speak.
Sure. I know you're listening carefully to organisations like the Federation of Small Business, but they say that 200,000 businesses are in serious trouble due to cash flow, and 300,000 have only weeks left. And they put a lot of this down to the current cost of living crisis or cost of doing business crisis, and particularly around energy costs. Those must be a real concern to you, those numbers.
Yes, I mean, we track things like business insolvencies and business profitability quite carefully. I mean, we haven't seen anything alarming in the numbers that we're seeing. In aggregate, business deposits, so the excess cash that businesses are sitting on, is worth about £100 billion. And that is true, I think, even looking exclusively at small and medium-sized businesses, that there are higher cash balances today than there were before the crisis. So and similar to what you've got on the household side, where you've had over £230 billion of excess savings having been built up, in the corporate sector you've had over £100 billion of excess kind of cash deposit savings built up as well. So there's a good amount of resilience there. We're not seeing any signs of distress. As I said, typical small business, particularly in the hospitality industry, for example, we'll see a £5,000 business rates tax cut this year, a £1,000 employment NICS tax cut, and have access to the recovery loan scheme as well, which still is out there if they need extra help with with liquidity issues. They also have the option, as over 1 million businesses took bounce back loans, which they'll be thinking about in their cash flow, the repayments for those. We have a program in place called Pay As You Grow, which enables those businesses to benefit either from 6-month payment holidays, interest-only periods, or to change those loans into 10-year loans, which almost halves a monthly repayment. And again, given those loans were taken out by quite a large number of businesses, almost all of them will be able to do something there that helps them with their cash flow needs.
Sure. I mean, I know you're always clued up in terms of international comparisons, but you've seen France, Germany, Italy, Greece all step in with support, cutting business energy taxes or providing subsidies and grants. I think France, multi-billion pound package. We seem to be the outlier in not providing some support for business in this area.
Well, I'd say if you look in total at the support we've provided with cost of living, it's about £37 billion over the various things we've done. It's worth about 1.5% of GDP. And to the best comparison that we can do, that puts us either ahead of or very much comparable to France, Germany, Italy and Japan, as other big G7 economies that are energy importers, unlike the others. So in an aggregate sense, we're very much providing...
That's the business.
They're looking across the board, right? Very comparable support. Now, look, we may have chosen to target more of that at vulnerable households, and so be it, right? And that I'm comfortable with that choice. And as I said, we've put other things in place that probably they don't feature in my £37 billion that are benefiting businesses. For example, as I said, the business rates discount, the employment allowance tax cut, and even something like fuel duty is a good example. Dan will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we estimate about 40% of the benefit of the fuel duty freeze and cut, again, that's worth £5 billion of support, the two things together, goes to businesses. So a typical van driver this year, as a result of the fuel duty freeze and the fuel duty cut, are going to save about £200 relative to what otherwise might have happened. That's quite significant. An HGV driver is probably about £1,500 from memory. So there's other things that we're doing, and none of those countries, by the way, have anything like the annual investment allowance, which is we've temporarily kept at this £1 million level. I think we've spoken about in this committee before. It's a very generous, easy to use tax relief for investment for all these companies as well.
Final quick question, Kevin.
Yes, just on that
Yeah.
actually. At the Mayor's lecture and then in the statement, you talked about improving incentives for businesses to invest. What are you going to do?
Well, without preempting it, what we have published is I don't know, is it an engagement document or a consultation document, Dan, but one of the two, Dan can correct me, which has a range of different options for how one might better incentivise business capital investment through the tax system. In the interest of time, I won't go into all the details here, but there's 4 or 5 different ways one could go about that, and they're all detailed in the document, and we're in the process of talking to businesses and business groups and any other interested parties about their views on the right approach. They're very much welcome any thoughts that the committee might have.
I mean, thank you. Yvonne, please.
Thank you. Chancellor, I'm sure you would agree that given the challenges facing public finance, it's vital that all taxpayer-funded support is targeted to reach those households generally struggling with the cost of living crisis. How many second homeowners will receive an £800 discount to their energy bills?
I completely agree. It's right that we target support where it's most...
772,000 households, or £620 million. How many people own 3 homes and are therefore in line to get £1,200?
So, sorry, are you carrying on? Do you want to finish? Or shall I
No,
answer?
I'm just wanting you to know how much money is going to people who some of us would think probably don't need that help.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There will be some people who don't need the help. That is, unfortunately, the consequence of having to do policy in practical terms. And I think we were talking previously about providing support on a more universal basis. So assuming you agree with that, which you may not, and that's fair enough, in which case fine, but if you do agree that you need to provide support on a more universal basis, given the scale of the challenge, then you have to think, well, how best can we do that?
There are 61,000 people who own 3 properties who will benefit to the tune of £1,200. That's a £73 million taxpayer-funded windfall. How much help will you get with your energy bills?
Actually, I'm donating mine to charity, so I made that clear a couple of weeks ago. So again, just to answer your question...
That's very philanthropic, Chancellor, but isn't it being philanthropic with other people's money? As Mrs Thatcher famously said, there is no such thing as government money, there's only taxpayer money. At a time when the total tax burden has risen to the highest level since the 1940s, is it really good use of taxpayer money for somebody on the Sunday Times rich list, or indeed for any MP or government minister to be receiving second home support when others are choosing between eating and heating?
I think the Labour Party policy was a VAT cut, which would have done the same thing, but potentially even more so, because it's linked directly to the size of your energy bill. So that would equally apply to that policy, and that's the challenge with universal policies, that they apply to everyone. So actually a VAT cut could be even more generous if your energy bill was particularly large, which if you had a very, very large home,
we're asking you about your
been.
Choices and your policies. I mean, is there any reason why you couldn't tackle people receiving multiple rebates through the self-assessment tax return like you do with child benefit?
So no, we actually had really only 2 ways to do something like this. I mean, you could have done VAT as the Labour Party proposed, but what we're doing, I believe, will be more generous to those on lower middle incomes than VAT.
Sorry, Chancellor, what I'm asking you is why you couldn't have ameliorated the system you chose by using the self-assessment tax assessment, just like you do for child benefit. Or perhaps you could use local authorities who are completely aware of who owns second homes.
Right, because we're delivering something through the energy bill system. What we have through local authorities is the council tax system. And we could, you're right, you can use a council tax system to do this. But as we're seeing currently with the delivery of the £150 rebate, that comes with its own set of challenges as well, and we wanted to make sure that the help got to people in as effective and efficient manner as possible, and that's why we've chosen to do it through energy bills. Now, you could choose to do it through council tax bills, definitely that's an option, but we chose to do it more universally than that, so as not to have people excluded, whereas the council tax system is only a rough proxy for household income. It's not a perfect proxy, it's only a rough proxy. So
could it not be a question of timing? For 5 months, you resisted Labour's calls for a windfall tax, adding 53 million to Britain's household bills for every day that you dithered. So why was it after 5 months, in the week of the Sue Gray Partygate report, you felt it was necessary to intervene?
Well, the reason we interviewed when we did was very clearly and simply because we had more clarity about what was going to happen to energy bills in the autumn. And as we were talking about
that particular week.
Well, actually, you heard from Ofgem that particular week, but we're also at the end of May about 2/3 of the way through the observation window for the price cap, the way the methodology works. And that seems to be a reasonable balance between having enough information to have good clarity on what the price cap is going to be so that you can size and scale the support appropriately, and going early enough to provide reassurance.
There is a pattern of behaviour going. When the government gets in crisis, taxpayer money can be thrown at everything in order to get off the hook. Surely we should have more respect for people who go out to work and pay their tax and are finding it very tough at the moment?
And that's why we announced very significant support to help them, and done actually after we knew what the size of the problem was, that we meant that we can get the support right, which had we done something months ago, actually, as other people were saying, it probably wouldn't have been sized appropriately, and we wouldn't have been able to then make sure we provide the reassurance that we were able to do, which I'm glad we've done, and I do believe helps people who need it. But no policy is perfect, and people may have other ways that they think they can deliver universal support. From our perspective, actually having gone through all the options, I don't think there is a better way to do it. We've erred on the side of being universal. I think that's the right thing to do. Now, you might disagree with that and say that we shouldn't be giving money to those on middle incomes. I think we should. And then once
I don't think we should be giving money to people who own 3 homes, no.
No, so then you need to have an alternative way to get people on middle incomes.
But perhaps if you did things at the right time, you'd have the time to consider how you could do that.
As I said, it's not possible that we found a way to do it, but as I said, if there's an alternative that you found, please do let us know. But also, having looked at the various delivery options that were in front of us, actually this is, we think, the most effective way to get support to a very large number of people in a way that will be timely and help them where they need to.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Thank you for sticking to time too. Emma, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Afternoon, Chancellor. The number one group of people who are contacting me at the moment really worried are pensioners. And I see the targeted part of your package on the benefit system requires that people are part of, obviously, the system. And the DWP data in the year end 2020 shows that the guaranteed pension, people on pension credit has a take-up rate of 73%. So we know that there are lots of people who are entitled to pension credit who aren't currently receiving it. So my first question is, are you doing anything with the DWP, with maps, etc., to try and advertise that pension credit is available and to increase that rate of take-up?
I think DWP are in the midst of a project to increase take-up of pension credit. I don't have the details precisely to hand. I don't know if Dan, you do exactly what they're doing, but I think they are. But that's one of the reasons that we provided universal support to pensioners, because we know that the take-up of pension credit is not at 100%. So there is an additional £300 cost of living payment for pensioners that will be delivered in the autumn alongside the winter fuel payment, and mean that a typical pensioner household will receive about
I've only got 7 minutes, so I'll go through
£850 of support this year.
One of the things that pensioners are talking to me about is they really don't understand the way these different benefits and announcements interplay with each other. They don't really understand the system, especially when I'm talking sort of elderly widows who often tell me that their husbands, people who dealt with all of this, they don't understand the system, they don't really know what's out there. So I'm pleased you're saying the DWP are actually looking into this, because my biggest concern about your announcement is it's not actually reaching the people that it's meant to reach. So I wondered whether you were working through maps, whether you were working with the DWP to look at sort of increasing take-up, look at the qualifying rules that's available for it, and look at providing some kind of clarity of information as to how do these things work with each other. Because I'm not speaking for every MP here, but we often tend to use charities and organisations like Turn to us for trying to calculate the benefits and things that people are available to. But in your role under looking at financial inclusion and support, what are you doing to ensure that what you've announced reaches the people it's meant to reach?
So with regard to the extra payment, it will be automatic, and that's a good thing. It won't need to be actively claimed, and we're using the winter fuel payment system, which is one of the benefits of it is it's a largely automated system where DWP actively just send the payments through, so people don't actively have to claim it. So they don't have to worry about that. They will just get the cash, which is a good thing. So that's how we've done it. So they were, whether people are confused or not, the cash will be coming to them, and we'll figure out
the
how best
pension
to
credit
communicate
still means they have to actively support it. And this is my concern with lots of these announcements. For example, as well, the 500 million to the household support fund, is it your expectation that councillors should push this money out to the households it knows who are in needs, or your expectation that those households need to proactively identify themselves and make that active request for support?
So I think in general it's a discretionary fund, and councils will do it in slightly different ways, I would imagine. What we tend to do, and this is what DLUC will do, is provide some guidance which gives a sense of the types of people that we expect to be covered. So one group that I mentioned is those on only housing benefit, and that data isn't held centrally, and it's hard for DWP or HMRC to do the payments there. But we know that there are a number of those people. So, for example, the guidance will say these are the types of people who should be a priority for this discretionary
Is
fund.
the expectation that councils would be proactively contacting them? The reason why I keep asking these questions, Chancellor, is because I am concerned the people who really need it don't know it's there, not aware that it's been announced, and wouldn't know how to apply for it even if they did. And they're the people I'm really worried about. But are you, when you're issuing this guidance, saying to councils they should proactively look for these people?
So I think, Emma, just in terms of people, the people we most care about, a third of all households are going to get this automatically when it comes to the £650, right? And the automatic on the energy bills on top of that, right? It is automatic, and we know that those are the most vulnerable people in our society, and that's a third of all households. Now look, there are always going to be people on the margins, but that's a very large number of people who will get a significant amount of support, essentially automatically. Pensioners, the same. They're going to get the extra payment automatically. And then for the discretionary fund, I imagine it will be a bit of both, because there will be groups of people, for example, housing benefit only claimants, which the local authority will know about, and will know, we will be clear in the guidance that those are a priority group. They would probably go to those people proactively, and then also be reactive to those who need
councils going for people proactively. They haven't got enough money to do that.
And the reason why I'm particularly asking, Chancellor, is because when you gave the money back on the council tax and the £150 back to people, the way the scheme was designed means that the people who don't pay by direct debit have to complete forms or fill in some kind of self-identification in able to receive the money. And I just wondered what the thinking was behind doing it that way, rather than issuing councils a set amount of money and just saying to those councils, discount your council tax bills. Because by putting in this extra step, what you're actually doing is preventing some of the people from receiving this £150.
So what's the extra step?
So if you don't pay by direct debit your
Yes.
council tax, you have to identify yourself to the council as a non-direct debit payer. You have to fill in some form of identification to verify that it's you that's on the council tax bill.
So the reason,
if you're not the named person, then there's additional steps. And so you have people who have the least amount of money not paying by direct debit, waiting the longest time for actual payment for this. And I'm saying, what was the decision behind doing it that way, rather than just saying to councils, discount your bills by £150?
it's simple, really, Dan. You should come in. The simple reason is not everyone actually has a council tax bill or a bill that is large enough to cope with that, and the council doesn't have their bank details. So they need to go through a process of actually talking to the people to get...
Discounted the bill when the bills were issued, you wouldn't have had to put these additional steps in.
Well, some people were trying to give the money as a lump sum, so rather than have it discounted over a period of time,
Then
people were getting the money as a lump sum.
I mean, I'll be putting these questions into the Treasury to find out how much money is actually not being taken up by people unable to claim this £150. What I'd really be keen to hear, Chancellor, is that you're looking to continually improve and design a system which gets rid of some of these fees.
Always, and that's actually why actually delivering £400 on a universal basis through energy bills will mean that you don't have to deal with all of those issues for far more people. But it comes, as we were discussing previously, every delivery mechanism has its own positives and drawbacks, but actually doing things through the energy bill system should be actually effectively quicker and get to more people in a more seamless, automatic fashion.
The only thing I was going to say is part of the reason the forms are there is also to prevent fraud, to make sure that you are who you say you are and you have previously that you are entitled to this discount, this £150 discount. And it's good. Whereas with the energy bill support scheme, because it's about electricity meters, there are different checks and balances in place, and people already have a relationship with the energy.
And this provider. Is a good example of, so when you've got a process, and we've talked about bounce back loans in this committee before, so when we've got a process that helps to mitigate against it, we're now talking about, oh gosh, this process
someone's a registered, I don't quite understand that point.
No, but
if someone was a registered council taxpayer and they paid their bills as a council taxpayer, I'm not sure where the fraud would come in if you discounted that bill, just because they chose not to pay it by direct debit.
Well, also it's where people move they move homes and have a different council tax provider, a different local authority.
It would be the issuing of the bill that would be discounted, not. That doesn't quite make sense.
But I'm really sorry. Is it really quick?
Yes,
it's literally a one-liner, and with a one-liner
it's a one-liner. Final point on a different topic, Chancellor, is on remote working. Could encouraging remote working reduce regional disparities and reinvigorate left-behind areas?
I'm not sure that has a one-line answer. The answer is probably it depends on the circumstances to the business in question, the employees in question. I don't think you can have a blanket response to that.
I'll have to write to you on that then.
Well, you could drop us a quick line with some further thoughts, if you might.
Yes, on how remote working can...
You may not have many further thoughts on it.
I was going to say,
if you do,
it would just depend. I don't think there is a blanket answer to the question.
Okay.
Yeah, not one that I've seen any
Thank you very
work
much.
on.
Angela.
Chancellor, if the off-gen price cap turns out to be higher than its initial estimate, will you provide further support, or is what you've announced it?
As I said, the answer I gave previously stands, that we're always responsive to the situation on the ground. We have a pretty good sense of what it's going to be. It is in any case an average, so plus or minus a bit. It probably doesn't change the overall picture largely. And as I was saying before, it's not possible for the government to fully insulate people from increases in the cost of living and inflation. So it's not as if it's something that we can precisely try and eliminate. So it would be right to not have, it wouldn't be right to have policy that is designed to do exactly that, because I think chasing a target like that could be dangerous, but we believe it's a significant intervention, and that, as I said, on the basis of what we know, makes a big difference. I guess the converse thing is if it's lower, I don't think we
come back for the money.
Yeah, we're not going to come back either if it's lower. So I think probably find that it's fine equally the same on both sides of it.
Right. Now, you were saying earlier to the chair of the committee that a third of the cost of this package so far is going to be covered by the windfall tax, leaving two-thirds of it, £10 billion, effectively taken from borrowing.
Yes, it will. The final split will be a function of what happens on the electricity generation.
And when are we likely to know about that?
As I said, we're in having those conversations urgently.
Yeah, but when are we likely to know? Is that
I can't say much.
Is that another mini statement, bit of a budget?
I said I can't, because it's a live tax policy, and there's not much more I can say other than what I said at the statement, where I explain the rationale, and we're now having those conversations with the industry to ascertain the scale of those extraordinary profits.
But a significant amount of the cost of this package is going to come from borrowing, isn't it?
I said it will depend on the scale.
We're at two-thirds at the moment.
Yes, and then that's an upper bound.
Which is possibly why it went down so badly on parts of your own back bench.
That's not.
Craig McKinley called it tripe. Richard Drax rather oddly called it throwing red meat to socialists. I must say, I'd never thought you were one of us, Chancellor, but it wasn't universally popular on your own backbenchers, was it? So how can you say, when you've introduced a package like this, which is at the moment and likely to remain financed by borrowing rather than tax rises, how can you still claim you're fiscally conservative?
So, well, what I'm claiming is that the overall fiscal policy that we've got in place is a responsible one, partly because we've taken a series of actually decisions that have been unpopular, and that's fine, because I want to try and do the thing that I believe is right, and that's what I always try and do. And that those difficult decisions mean that we're on a trajectory to have borrowing reducing significantly from the peak that it reached over the next few years, including this year. And our debt falling sustainably again. I think that is the right approach. Having a strong medium-term framework provides credibility to the markets, which is important, and it allows us, because of those decisions, it allows us to have the space to respond to shocks and challenges as they arise, and that's what we've done.
The subsidies already going into North Sea oil in tax breaks for continue to explore there are very substantial, aren't they? 3.1 billion in 2019, 2.5 billion in 2020. You're really only raising in the windfall tax the subsidies you've already given to people to carry on operating in the North Sea, aren't you?
I don't look at it like that. We're raising what I think is a meaningful amount of revenue, £5 billion, but doing so in a way that is supportive of investment in the North Sea, with a new investment relief that doubles the amount of investment tax relief that exists in the system, meaning about for every £1 that people invest, just over 90 pence of it they can get back in tax relief. So as we've designed it in a way that I think is balancing the, raising revenue and taxing profits fairly, with a desire to continue to support investment, and I think it's been largely acknowledged as doing that.
Did you consider taking more than 5 billion?
As I said, this strikes, I think, the right balance between taxing the profits fairly, but also incentivising investment.
Now, your former colleague, the former Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Jesse Norman, has written a letter today calling on the Prime Minister to resign. Do you agree with him?
No, not.
No?
No.
You worked with him for a couple of years. You must have some respect for him.
Of course, I worked with Jesse for a while since I had this job, and he did a very good job, and I'm grateful for the job he did for me.
In his letter, Jesse Norman says to the Prime Minister that to describe yourself as vindicated by the Sue Gray report is grotesque. Do you agree with his judgment on that?
As I say, I'm not entirely sure what this has to do with the statement, but I disagree with him, as I said, and I support the Prime Minister, but I thank Jesse for the job he did when he was a Minister in the Treasury.
I think political stability has quite a lot to do with how we perform economically, Chancellor. In his letter, he also says breach of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is what's being constantly threatened by this government, would be economically very damaging, politically foolhardy, and almost certainly illegal. Do you agree with him about that?
So that's not the intention. The intention is to have a dialogue with our partners, which we're continuing to do, to make sure that we can try and reach a sensible settlement to some of the challenges that we're seeing about Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom economically, where there are very clear challenges, and the protocol is proving to be a barrier to a resumption of a functioning executive in Northern Ireland. It's right that we try and take steps to address that.
Do you agree with the Prime Minister's anti-corruption champion, John Penrose, who resigned today because he judges that the Prime Minister has broken the ministerial code and ought to resign?
I disagree, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. Now going to go to Rushanara, please.
By the bell, from Dame Angela. Chancellor, I wanted to talk to you about the interaction between your announcement and the off-gem cap and the OBR. When you came to this, when you gave evidence last, after the spring statement, you said it's very difficult to sit here today and speculate on what will happen to energy prices and therefore the biggest impact on living standards in the autumn. Let's wait until we get there, and then we can decide on the most appropriate course of action. Obviously, it's been 2 months. It has only been 2 months. What made you change your mind, and was it because of political pressure?
No, the way the price cap works, there's an observation window which runs from February to August from memory, right? Actually, until you are through that observation window, you don't know what the price cap is going to be. That's how it's calculated. So whilst people might have estimates and all the rest of it back in February, what you don't have is any actual data that informs how the price cap works. So we are now about 2/3 of the way through that observation window. So the data that actually will set the price cap, we have a lot more of it in, and back then we had close to zero of it.
There was no political pressure on Mr. Brearley to provide a rough forward estimate for the price cap, and there was no political consideration or pressure.
We of course are in a constant dialogue with Ofgem on a weekly basis to get constant estimates, as I have been throughout the observation window. I'm always asking for estimates of what the price cap might be towards the autumn, and obviously the further along you go through the observation window, that the more confidence you have in that estimate being a reflection of what will actually happen. That's just it's not a perfect estimate now because there's still a period to run, but obviously the more that you've got behind you, so the more confidence you can have in what the final estimate is. But it is just that. It is still, even now, an estimate, but as I said, about 2/3 of the actual data required is I believe, now formally already in our hands.
And the week in which you made that announcement, people are very sceptical about the fact that it came out, Siobhan raised it earlier, it came out the day after the Sue Gray report. Wouldn't it have been more orderly to have actually had an OBR assessment and to make that announcement earlier on during the spring statement rather than during that time, 2 months later, and in the week when it was clearly an attempt to divert attention from law breaking by the Prime Minister?
So, the spring statement forecasts all closed in the beginning of March. As I said, the observation window at that point had barely opened for the autumn price cap. So anything that you did then had the potential to be quite wrongly sized. So just not. I mean, you could have done something, and you wouldn't have had confidence that it would be the right thing to do because you didn't know what was going to happen to energy bills. So actually, you now have had you've now had more of the time that you need, February, March, April, May, right? That you've got 4 of the 6 months of the observation window roughly behind you now. So that data is in, and that means you can have a much more informed sense of what's going to happen to energy bills. That's why you can't do it. And with regard to OBR,
you had indicated that you'd look at it later on in the autumn.
I had just said.
What changed your mind?
I think I've always said I wanted more clarity around the price.
You got clarity in that week. You seem to you seem to have clarity to make an announcement in a week when the Prime Minister was in trouble, and you made an announcement the day after
I think it's more what I've always said. I want to strike the right balance between providing reassurance to people, because I know that there's a lot of anxiety about this, and many people have been saying, actually be good to know what's coming, and balancing that with waiting to have enough information to make sure that what we did was more likely than not to be appropriately sized. I mean, that's a straightforward trade-off. There's really no perfect way to trade those things off. And again, doing it in Parliament, so I could answer yours and others' questions.
The day after the Sue Gray report.
I guess look, maybe we'd have preferred it to wait longer, but that would have meant people
done it earlier,
and then it could well have been wrongly sized.
Weeks earlier, even. Anyway. There was no political pressure on Mr. Brearley. You've had regular conversations with Ofgem, no political pressure.
I think the team are in touch with Ofgem on a very regular basis, and we constantly I'm asking for updates on what the price cap is likely to be in the autumn. Right, we track that on a very regular basis.
Are you concerned that you're announcing large fiscal measures outside of the budget or spring statement, which means that they're announced without us seeing the impact on the wider economy and without independent costings analysis from the OBR? And we understand why during the pandemic things needed to happen in a different way, but isn't that of concern, that the way you're making these announcements?
I mean, no, I think the circumstances are reasonably exceptional given the scale of the challenge that we're seeing. That it meant that it was the right.
Prime Minister was in a lot of trouble, and you need to come up with the right
thing to do. And I think the committee will know, obviously, that the way that the OBR forecasting process works it doesn't particularly lend itself to moving at speed. It is a process that takes something like a dozen weeks in general from start to finish. So actually, it doesn't lend itself to more rapid policy and decision making.
This announcement at this point lent itself to nothing, which is not not a particularly helpful way to make policy. There's no opportunity to have any assessment. So.
Well, I think, look, I mean, there are always independent think tanks and other bodies who have provided
but
their
the
assessment.
OBR has a particular, with respect, Chancellor, the OBR has a particular function. We have a role to scrutinise you and what you do. You are leaving Parliament in a position, and this committee in a position, and it's not first, in a position where we don't have that independent assessment, and I don't think that's acceptable. Even if you're doing, of course, I welcome the announcement. And the support that's being provided. That's not the point here. The point is about how government conducts its business, and it speaks to a wider problem in the way that this government, your government, has been operating, where it's playing fast and loose with big decisions that need proper consideration and proper scrutiny, and it's not happening. And what's clear is in the week that you made that announcement, the day after the Sue Gray report, this was a political decision, not an economic decision, with the opportunity for us to have the evidence to...
I think it's just a trade-off, right? If you think it would have been better for the country and people to have waited 12 weeks to have that, then so be it. I just disagree with that.
It's not
right?
beyond the realm of possibility
I think
and your talents to have been able to make this announcement during the spring statement or in a more orderly way rather than use a major announcement to divert attention from the Prime Minister's law breaking. That's what was really going on, wasn't it, Chancellor? And isn't that irresponsible for somebody who has got a big, important job to play, and you were credited for the work you did during the pandemic, and here you are, falling into the trap of trying to save the Prime Minister by making an announcement the day after the Sue Gray report to take that story off the headlines.
We're having the same conversation again and again. I took the judgment, rightly I believe, not to do this at the spring statement because no one had any real sense of what would happen to energy bills in the autumn. Because it's not physically possible to do so because you were only weeks into a 6-month observation window. So anything you did at that point would have been quite speculative. And as you say, if these are big decisions, it's important we get them right. Doing them on an entirely speculative basis, I don't think would have been the appropriate thing to do. So then it's a judgment call about, or when do you have enough information for it to be an informed judgment, early enough to provide reassurance to people, which is something that lots of people, including I think the Labour Party, were calling for. And I think waiting another 12 weeks, or however long it would have taken, was probably not the right balance.
Somebody of your gravitas and talents shouldn't have fallen into the trap of trying to take part in Operation Save Big Dog, or whatever that phrase is that people in the Conservative Party have used to save the Prime Minister from law breaking. I think we expect better from you, and you shouldn't be dragged into his mess, frankly.
I'm glad that you said you welcome the measures, and I'm glad that it seemed that the main concern was around the timing, or opposed to the substance,
right.
And the substance of the
substance
of the announcements, which is welcome to hear.
To Julie now because we're running over a bit. Julie,
thank
please.
you very much,
Thank
Chair. Chancellor, the week before you announced the energy profits levy, in the Chamber you said that you do not believe that windfall taxes are the simple and easy answer to every problem. What changed your mind?
No, I don't believe. I still believe what I said then. I don't think they're the knee-jerk response that one should always reach for in situations like this. But as I said, I'm pragmatic about their use, and I think if you have a situation where, as we do here, there are companies that are making extraordinary profits, in large part as a result of a war, then it's reasonable to think, well, actually, we should tax those profits fairly. So I think that is a reasonable approach. But I think you want to be thoughtful about it, and the thing that I've always said consistently is the thing that is in my mind is investment, and making sure that you try and tax those profits fairly, but do so in a way that continues to support investment, because that's something that I think it's good for jobs, it's good for the economy, and in this instance, it's good for energy security. So we took the time to design a levy that was not as blunt an instrument as some, which others have suggested, and contains a very generous incentive to invest included within it, which I think gets that balance right between raising money fairly but also incentivising investment.
We mentioned extraordinary profits. During COVID, there were times when actually the sector was making, you might call, extraordinary losses. We don't subsidise the sector in those circumstances. So is it right that we should then tax profits?
Yeah, well, actually, I think back in 2016 around, I've put it in here sometime, at a time when the oil price went back down to about $40, I think, Harriet might remember, I can't remember if she was at the Treasury then, but actually, back then, actually, I think it was Philip Hammond probably who put in place a range of things that did beneficially improve the tax regime for all these companies in reflection of the fact that oil prices at that point everyone thought were stuck at $40 for a very lower for longer, I think was the refrain that you heard. So I don't think it's not completely right to say that we haven't made changes in the other direction when prices have gone lower. The government has in the past done that. But I said, look, there's a range of what one might consider relatively normal ups and downs of commodity cycles. These prices are particularly high, and they're high in part driven by a war, and I think it was reasonable, therefore, to take this pragmatic approach. But so do so in a way that supports investment.
Thank you. I mean, there's another aspect that most of the profits from companies like BP and Shell are actually not made in the North Sea. So there's a case to saying actually the windfall profits are actually being taxed twice. So they're being made elsewhere, and then we're taxing them twice, actually.
No, that's not. This tax regime, we have a very specific UK tax regime that's been in place for decades, which applies specifically to the UK continental shelf, if I'm getting the terminology right, to the extraction of, I see Angela nodding as well, so good, I probably have got that right. So it applies, well, we've got all these former Treasury ministers, so keep me on my toes. But it applies very specifically to the activities of fossil fuel extraction in that in there. So it's a very ring-fenced regime for that and doesn't apply to profits they make elsewhere. They or any other companies.
Thank you. Is it fair to have excluded, to say that companies can't offset their losses from this particular tax as well? Is that fair?
Yes, it's something that we've done similarly in the past with, for example, the bank levy works in the same way, the residential developer property tax works in the same way. Because if what you're trying to do is to tax genuinely excess profits, it wouldn't be reasonable, I don't think, or it would undermine the policy rationale of that, to then allow losses which had nothing to do that to be offset against it. I don't know, Dan, if you want to add anything on that.
No, I mean, that's exactly right. We did that in various things that were done with the corporation tax regime for banks, where the carry forward of losses was excluded from being set against the additional corporation tax, and the other bits of the North Sea regime, so the sort of 30% ring-fence corporation tax rate and the supplementary charge allow carry forward, but this additional 25% on top won't allow carry forward for the reasons the Chancellor said.
Okay, thank you. You've said that the levy will fall away when prices return to normal. Can you define normal?
Yeah, I mean, that's a conversation we're having with the industry as well. I think the last time this was done, a price target was published, which was $74, $75 for Brent. Now, if you look, so there's kind of one benchmark there. I think that if you look at the average Brent price over the last, say, 5 or 10 years, that would give you a number of something like $60 or $70 oil. If you look at what most of these companies communicate to their shareholders and what they consider to be normalized oil prices, so what are they telling their own investors? They tend to use numbers like $60, 70 in that range as well. So that give you a sense. That's kind of give you a sense. I think we want to make sure that it is. We've got a complicated situation. We've got gas and oil, so we need to think a little bit about that. And then to provide reassurance that this is not meant to be a permanent feature of the tax regime, there will be a sunset clause of just over 3 years in the legislation itself as a backstop. But obviously, if prices come back to the range that I've discussed, then you would expect this to fall away sooner.
Thank you. That's it. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Julie. Gareth, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to carry on the conversation about the levy and specifically get into the detail about the investment component of it. The investment allowance of the levy is available to companies, as I understand it, at the point of investment. Can you just talk us through how this compares to previous investment allowances for these companies and what the pros and cons of that are?
Yeah. Thank you. And I know this is something that we've discussed previously, Gareth, because I know you're conscious of trying to incentivise business investment. So this was another feature that we changed. Now people are focused on the headline percentage relief that we've given, which is substantial and generous. But the other significant change we made is to make sure that relief applies immediately at the moment of investment. That is different to how the investment relief that currently exists within that regime operates, where actually it doesn't apply until that project starts generating revenue, which is often not for years. 5 years on average. So we made this change again to make it very supportive of investment. So it's not just the rate that is more generous, because it applies immediately on an MPV basis, it will be considerably more generous than what currently exists, as I said. So it adds to the idea that we really genuinely want to try and bring forward that investment.
Okay, and what modelling has the Treasury done on the impact of this allowance for investment as compared to before the levy, for example?
Yeah. So look, we have. I mean, I'll let Dan talk to it. There are the standard models that we would use that the OBR will no doubt publish their own analysis on when they next do the forecasts. But using those standard models that we have and expected behavioural responses, we expect this to not have a significantly negative impact on investment. It may well be that it increases it, but these are models, so there we go. But we wanted to make sure that at least on the models that have been used by OBR and us in the past, that this relief was generous enough that it wouldn't significantly impact investment, and that's what the models are.
I don't really have much to add. So the ABR will have to do this as part of their wider forecast when they take into account, their wider investment forecast, all the measures and so on. But using the sorts of methodologies they use, as the Chancellor says, we think that this will be a net positive impact on investment, and therefore there will be more investment than before. But the precise amount of that is very much subject to OBR scrutiny.
Okay, well, inevitably, I'm then going to ask if it is, as you say, as modelled, and it is more impactful and increases investment, would you consider carrying this forward, keeping it going as an investment incentive, even when the tax element of the levy expires?
I think probably not, because it relates to the very, there's a extra levy, and that comes with this extra investment relief. There is already a generous treatment of investment within the ring-fence regime. They benefit from full expensing on capital investment. So that actually the status quo regime is already pretty generous. But to Kevin's question earlier, we're hoping to make the overall tax system more supportive and generous towards capital investment anyway after the super deduction expires. So for all non-ring-fenced investment, that hopefully will benefit from a cheaper or a more generous treatment, as I said. But this will revert back to what it is, which is, as I said, higher tax rate, but more generous investment treatment as well.
Also, just to add, a part of the investment effect is the fact that it's temporary. So both the higher tax rate is temporary, and therefore the higher investment allowance is temporary. So the incentive to invest while the value of the investment relief is so high, when the payback may come when the tax has fallen away, that is part of the reason you get the sort of temporary investment effect, a little bit like the wider super deduction, where its time limited nature brings forward investment.
Both of you mentioned the super deduction. You'll be aware there's some criticism that it's not resulted in as much investment as was perhaps hoped or expected or even planned for. What makes you think that this investment incentive will be more impactful or more successful than that super deduction?
Yeah, we're still collecting data and talking to industry about the impact of the super deduction. I think the big difference there is you obviously had Omicron in the towards the middle of it, and we were not completely done with coronavirus, right? So that was a big extra added bit of uncertainty that got put in the mix. It will be very hard to disaggregate the impact of that, but it probably did have some impact. And hopefully that is not the situation here. And I think the way that these companies are making investment decisions is probably slightly different. It's quite specific. And now that we've published an energy security strategy that has a very clear role for particularly natural gas in the medium term to support our transition, and there's other policies that are supportive of that. For example, licensing decisions that are being done at a kind of faster pace, et cetera, et cetera. I think actually, I'm confident that there's a strong signal from government to the industry that we want to see that investment, and there's also a medium-term policy framework that is supportive of it, not just the short-term tax relief.
Okay, thank you. Recent developments in Ukraine have shown and highlighted the importance of oil and gas, domestic oil and gas, not just for security of supply, but also the bridge to low carbon future that we all hope for. How clear have you been with energy companies once you've announced this investment incentive that you hope that will go towards investment in fixing essentially, I see in front of me, North Sea Transition Authority expects output to fall 30% over the next 5 years. There's 363 undeveloped discoveries. Have you been clear with the energy companies where you expect this investment to go if they take the incentive?
Yes, well, look, there's a ring-fence regime, so in one sense it applies quite specifically to a group of companies, and a relatively small group of companies. There are about 20 or 30 who paid any tax in that regime over the last couple of years, and it is a fraction of that account for most of the revenue. So we're only talking about the relatively small number here. And yeah, we have been, we've been clear, not just on this, but I think, as I said, the energy security strategy was warmly welcomed by the sector as being a strong statement of support for their role in the transition, which they wanted to hear from government, and we've provided that reassurance. And then it's not just the fiscal regime, as I said, there's other things that matter, for example, the permitting and licensing. And again, on all those things, you're seeing progress from the Energy Secretary to make sure that we can improve our energy security, and that is a part of it.
I'm at time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gareth. Alison, please.
Thank you very much. Moving on from oil and gas to electricity generators and the suggestion you've made that there will be a tax on them coming forward. Can you tell me a bit more about that and the timescales for it?
No, I'm sorry, Alison, I can't say much more given it was a live tax policy other than what I said at the statement, which is, do believe that there are extraordinary profits being made in that sector. And that is the result of how the market works, which is the price for electricity being set at the marginal supplier, which at the moment is natural gas, at these very elevated levels. And there will be lots of people whose costs of producing electricity are much, much lower than that. And that is where these excess or extraordinary profits arise. We're working urgently with industry to understand the scale of what those might be, and then the best way to address that is. And as I said, other European countries have taken steps to do that. We have a longer term plan the Energy Secretary published, a plan to reform the market in order to actually deal with that. But again, that we need to figure out how quickly that can be put in place and whether there's a better answer in the short term.
The figure of £10 billion has been bandied about in terms of excess profits. Would it surprise you to know that SSE said this morning to me that they don't recognise that figure?
I don't recognise that figure. Hasn't been necessarily. We have not put out any public figure. So
Okay.
I said,
You're describing excess profits. You must have an idea of how much that
is. You wouldn't expect me to comment publicly on tax policy as it's being developed. There's lots of different.
You put it in your statement.
As I said, beyond what I said in the statement. Right. So I'm not able to get into the specifics of a tax policy that's under development. And I said the scale of the profits is something that we are working through in the industry.
You believe there's an extraordinary profit. You must have an idea of what that extraordinary profit is if you're bringing forward a policy to tax it.
We're in the process of talking to the companies to figure out the scale of what we think the profits are. Because there's lots of different particular circumstances that companies might be in. For example, if they've sold forward the energy already at a particular price, then that will mean that a desktop analysis, which looks at the current spot price, won't take that into account. So we need to go through that analysis with the companies.
Mm-hmm. You said earlier you're going to bring forward urgently. When should we expect a statement on that?
I said as soon as we can go through the work.
Weeks, months?
Not months.
Weeks then.
Urgently is not months and months, but.
Okay. Are you aware that this is already having an impact on investment in the renewable sector? How do you expect to achieve net zero targets, to meet the commitments of COP26 last year if you're going to disincentivise bringing forward investment in renewable generation?
We currently already have a very generous investment regime in place because of the super deduction, which means that any investment in renewables that's happening right now benefits from the most generous treatment of capital investment, not just in the UK's kind of recent history, but also pretty much anywhere in the world. It is the most generous treatment of capital investment that exists anywhere at the moment because of the super deduction. That's the regime that we have in place. So that, anyone wanting to do that now, they should crack on. They'll benefit from that relief.
Well, it's difficult for investors to crack on if they don't know what this regime is going to look like in a few weeks' time.
But the capital investment relief exists today, so that's the relief on the investment they're making today. In terms of the energy market reform, that is something that we need to get right, and that's why we're having the conversation with them now to, as quickly as possible, figure out what the situation is. But I do believe that people's energy bills being, we've had this conversation about cost of living, right? If that's being driven by the way that pricing works, which means that people's cost of producing the electricity, the price that actually our constituents are paying bears no relation to that, that's probably something that we should try and fix. And that's what many other countries have taken steps to try and do. Now, there are different ways of doing that, but that does seem to me the right approach. So I do think people paying more for their electricity than they have to is not a good thing. We want to make people's living standards higher. We want to reduce the burden of them of energy bills.
With respect, Chancellor, that's not what this is about. This is about investment in the renewables sector, a sector which is really significant to the Scottish economy in particular, and the Scottish Government has made a huge commitment to that. What discussion have you had with the Scottish Government about your plans for taxation in the renewables sector?
But it is about that. This is exactly what we're talking about, is excess profits that are being made in the same way as there are extraordinary profits being made in oil and gas. There are extraordinary profits being made in electricity generation. Now, it doesn't matter who's making those profits. The principle and the economic logic for it is exactly the same, right? So if we've got a war that's driving up gas prices to these very high levels, and then to levels that nobody anticipated, and that's causing particular people to be making these very large profits, and ultimately driving up everyone's electricity bills, your constituents, my constituents, contributing to this cost of living challenge that we've been discussing, I think it's absolutely right that the government looks at that and figures out if the policy we've got in place means that that is working as effectively as it should be. And that is the work that we're doing.
There are lots of questions about what exactly this will mean for investment in renewables in Scotland. So can I ask you again, what discussions have you had with the Scottish Government about this policy?
I think we would normally consult, as we always would, and I think in the process of what we're doing, we do that. As a tax policy, it's a reserve tax policy, so you would expect us to make the policy.
The Scottish Government has a very clear net zero strategy, very encouraging of renewables, both onshore and offshore wind, tidal, other mechanisms as well within Scotland. What discussions do you intend to have with the Scottish Government before you bring forward a policy that might hit investment in renewables in Scotland?
So we do have policies that support renewables investment, particularly in offshore wind, as we've already seen, where our track record on this is very strong. And because of the super deduction at the moment, it's a very generous climate to invest in renewables, and invest in everything, actually. And so I feel pretty positive about the outlook for it, and the energy security strategy was warmly welcomed by the renewable sector. But I would hope that the Scottish Government also would be keen on making sure that people's energy bills are not any higher than they need to be. That's our priority, and if we think that there are sensible reforms that should be made to the market so that people's energy bills can come down or not go up as much as they currently are, I think that would be a good thing for us to explore, and that's what we're doing.
One of the ways of ensuring that we're not in such a crisis in the future is to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and move more into net zero, into wind, into tidal, into other renewable technologies in which Scotland has a lead. Chair, I'm quite disappointed the Chancellor hasn't actually answered the question about when he's going to discuss this with the Scottish Government, but I sense I'm not going to get an answer.
I mean, I'd be very happy to, if there's something that they want to send us, or we can make sure that happens. Yeah, that's not a problem at all.
Could I just add one thing about, so a lot of renewables that are renewable investment that takes place under the contract for difference, already because of the way contracts for difference are constructed, it's not possible for those investments to make extraordinary profits, and that would be a thing that, as part of considering how a tax might work, we would want to consider. If they're not making extraordinary profits through contracts for difference, where is this tax then coming from?
Because there are lots of legacy renewables that weren't done under a CFD.
So there are electricity generators that are not in CFDs where the price of electricity was £61 per megawatt hour in the first quarter of last year, and by the fourth quarter it was £223, I think, something like that. And if you're in a contract for difference, that would be clawed back effectively, a tax of sorts. But if you're not on a contract for difference and your costs haven't changed, then it's possible that you're making these large profits, and that's what we're discussing.
Yeah. And that's the reform that many other countries in Europe are in the process of, or having taken steps to reform their markets. And indeed, that is the UK's plan as well, and that was there in the energy security strategy. But this is obviously as an acute issue at the moment, and it's causing people's energy bills to be higher than they otherwise would be. And I think we probably all share a collective desire to try and ease the burden of the cost of living and higher energy bills on our constituents. And I would imagine the Scottish Government would support that, but maybe not.
That sounds this will be horribly complex to bring in a couple of weeks.
Leave that there, but it may be that we write to the Chancellor with any further questions you might have on that, Alison, but thank you. Finally, to Harriet, please.
Thank you very much. And Chancellor, you've mentioned quite a few times your desire to make sure that our constituents don't pay higher energy bills than they need to. And I want to use my questions to explore historic decisions made by government and by the regulators that may potentially have had the opposite effect. And the first one I wanted to explore was around the number of different energy providers that have failed, including Bulb, which I understand is going to end up costing taxpayers about £2 billion. Is it possible that Ofgem have let you down by not properly ensuring that these companies were adequately capitalised, and what are we going to do about that, because we don't want the Treasury to keep on having to provide sticking plasters for the failure of this aspect of energy policy?
Yes, Harriet, that's an excellent question, and you'll forgive me because I think you'll understand, obviously, that Ofgem and the Energy Secretary, or Secretary of State, is the person responsible for how the regulatory regime works directly, so I want to make sure I'm not treading on his toes. I think he is having those conversations about, is our regulatory regime working as it should be. Ofgem have already put out some consultations about how to tweak something.
It is costing the Treasury £2 billion, isn't it?
Yes. Well, it's costing bill payers, all of us, as we heard previously. There is no government money; it's all everyone else's money. So that is the cost of these companies failing, right? And that is so. We have to look and make sure that the regulatory regime we have going forward is doing what it needs to do. So I'm sure there are lessons that can be learned, but I'm sorry not to be more specific, because it would be a question for the Secretary of State for him to decide how best to go about making sure that we do learn the lessons and this doesn't happen
you traded
again.
through the financial crisis, so you've seen how expensive it was for the taxpayer when the banks failed, and now it's going to be expensive for the taxpayer and effectively the bill payers because of the failure of all of these. So presumably you're giving a very strong steer to the Business Secretary that you don't want to see this happen again. You can
expect that's what we've said. Yeah, and I think, and Harry, you're right. It's because we have to think that there's a trade-off again, as with all these things. You want a regulatory regime that was supportive of competition, because in general we think competition is a good thing for driving down prices for consumers and improving choice. But it needs to be competition that's based on an underlying fundamentals that are sound, right? And obviously, if we've got businesses that weren't fundamentally sound, and the tab is then going to have to be picked up by taxpayers, that's not a good outcome, right? And we need to make sure we have a system that means that doesn't happen.
Taking another decision that probably wasn't yours, but ends up being, I think, potentially short-term thinking at the Treasury, which was around the rough gas storage facility that it was decided that it would be too expensive to subsidise that storage facility. It was old infrastructure, it got closed down, but now we read reports that it's likely to be reopened and subsidised by the Treasury. Is that correct?
Again, I guess a question for the Energy Secretary, because they're responsible for the storage aspect of things.
You from the point of view of being Chancellor, will not be providing money to do that. Is that what I'm hearing?
You wouldn't expect me to comment on things before they're done. But I said, I think in general, I can't, again, I'm not the Energy Minister, forgive me for not having the details to hand, the exact details. I think given the challenge we're experiencing, I'm not sure that would make...
It's a live conversation between the Treasury and the Business Secretary, is it then, about finding a way to subsidise the reopening of that gas storage facility?
Not that I'm actively involved in. Now, I don't think... I mean, again, there's always conversations that are going on in government, and we should make sure that we have the right energy security, and there's lots of different things one might want to do. I wouldn't assume, from what I've been told, I don't think that one storage facility is going to be the difference between people's energy bills going up the way they're going to go up and not.
But gas prices have come off a lot, haven't they?
At the moment now. So it would be if you had some, but I think even that, given the scale of the increase, and given the storage is only, I think, I don't have the numbers, but I think it's not that significant in the scheme of things. It would clearly make a difference, because right now, you're right, gas prices are very low temporarily, because there's a lot of LNG coming into the country. We're exporting, we're sending as much as we can to continental Europe, and typically that flows reverse. Now, clearly, if we had more storage right now, that would be good. It probably would mean the price would be not as low. That's part of the reason it's as low. But I don't think it would make we'd still be sitting here talking about, I would imagine, a very significant increase in energy bills in the autumn. I don't think it would make the difference massively to the scale of the challenge, from what I understand.
Turning to the scale of the challenge in terms of nuclear generation, and I think that Jesse Norman, as a former energy minister, alluded to this in his letter today, that he thought it was unrealistic in terms of the expectation of the speed of turning back on or building nuclear, and so there is talk of extending the life of Hinkley B further, and apparently EDF have said that that's actually technically not possible. We've missed the deadline for doing that. Are you in conversations with any of these nuclear power stations about subsidising, extending their life?
That'd be a question that BEIS would be responsible for.
But are you in conversation with them about
we're in conversation with EDF all the time, because obviously there's a very large project that we're in the process of nuclear project. We're in the process of trying to move to a final investment decision at a kind of effective pace. So we're always having conversations with EDF in general anyway. But again, those are led by the Energy Secretary.
And in terms of your goal of trying to keep future energy bills down, how much is the Treasury sort of prepared to subsidise some of that new nuclear and extending the life of existing nuclear?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a balance in having an energy mix that is reliable, secure, and affordable, and there's not a perfect solution, so you're constantly trading off against those things. I think our approach would be to try and make sure that we have systems that can provide affordable energy at as competitive a price as possible, that's also renewable or non-carbon. Nuclear, it is reliable baseload power, which is a good thing. We can have it here. It's not historically been the cheapest form of energy, and has required a decent amount of government involvement going forward. Because
you're open to continuing.
We're having those conversations, for example, with EDF on Sizewell, and so the government has to be involved in these large-scale nuclear projects because of the way that they now are financed. And that obviously comes on bill payers, but also we're providing R&D and capital grant funding for SMRs, which may well be a promising technology for the future as well.
Turning to another way in which consumers can keep their energy bills down, which is getting better insulation, triple glazing, and so on. You did put some measures in the spring statement that helped with keeping those costs down, but there are a lot of other ways in which that could be potentially encouraged. Other countries do more in this regard. There's also ridiculous rules around conservation areas and not doing double glazing when you have an older building that councils are very strict on enforcing and things like that. Tell us about your thinking on how we can help consumers keep their bills down.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right, and in the spring statement we cut VAT on energy saving materials. Which
does that include insulation?
Sorry?
Does that include
That includes
insulation?
the existing set of measures. It's not insulation related. It's It's things like heat pumps and
the reduction in VAT on energy saving materials applies to loft and cavity wall insulation, albeit that those are they're less expensive to buy and fit than, for example, a heat pump. But it does make a difference.
It will make a difference. It will actually, yes.
Yeah.
We're spending over the Parliament over £6 billion on energy efficiency. Right, so it's a very significant. I think it's over £6.5 billion on a range of different things, everything from heat networks to the boiler scrappage scheme to public sector building decarbonisation to lots of schemes focused on those in fuel poverty and social housing, etc., etc. Right, so that there's a big pie available. I think it's, are we getting the best bang for our buck for that pie? It's a fair question. We need to make sure we are. You're right in that there are things that are relatively easy to do that will save people real money, and I think insulation is the obvious one, because cavity, and particularly cavity wall and loft insulation and smart controls, those things can all be done in relatively short order in a day or two at max. They tend to cost, say, £250 for smart controls, £250 for loft insulation, just over £1,000 for cavity wall. So in the scheme of things, they are not the kind of £10,000 very expensive thing. They're that much more manageable, and they tend to save something like £200 or £300 a year off energy bills once they're done, right? So it's quite a significant return there. We are looking at how is the market working, because to your point, so for example in Ireland they've pioneered a kind of one-stop shop approach. It's just bringing together, because there are some good mortgage type products or loan products, there's energy companies that can help, there's building people that want to do it, there is government grant available, so can we knit those things together in a slightly better way to make them more accessible? It's, I think, a really fair challenge and one we're actively looking at.
Thank you, Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Harry. I'm going to pull stumps there, because I did personally assure you we would be done by 1:15, and I'm going to stick to that. Can I thank the committee for actually being very disciplined in the questions you put within time, and also to you, Chancellor, for making yourself available at short notice to be accountable to this committee on the statement that you made to the House, and also on a day where I think it's fair to say there's rather a lot going on. So on that note, this hearing is concluded. Order.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended.